Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and happy Pride, listeners. It is Pride Month here in the United States. June is our month to celebrate LGBTQIA plus pride and empowerment. I do know that there are other times of the year set aside in other countries around the world, but the fact that it is Pride Month here in the US gives me a great excuse to do an episode focused on quote-unquote gay characters in Agatha Christie. Yes, it is all about the gays on this episode. How has it taken me 7 years to get here? That is the real question underlying this episode. I will start by stating what strikes me as the obvious, which is that I identify as a gay man. That does not mean that I speak for all gay men or for anyone other than myself, but as a self-identifying gay man who loves Agatha Christie, I have some thoughts on this topic, and by some thoughts, I mean a lot of thoughts. But before we get into all of that, first things first, listeners, in that I will be mentioning who the murderers are in most of the titles I will be discussing, I will be spoiling significant aspects of the following plays, short stories, and novels by Agatha Christie. This is a spoiler-heavy episode. So in terms of plays, I will be spoiling The Mousetrap, though in a very limited way. Have no fear. I am sticking to my commitment not to spoil The Mousetrap in any major way. So I will be minorly spoiling one aspect of The Mousetrap, and I will be very much spoiling the rats. In terms of short stories, I will be spoiling Death by Drowning and Greenshaw's Folly. And in terms of novels, there are a whole bunch of them. So here goes. After the Funeral, Cards on the Table, Endless Night, Five Little Pigs, Halloween Party, Lord Edgware Dies, The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, The Moving Finger, Mrs. McGinty's Dead, A Murder is Announced, Murder is Easy, and last but very much not least, because I'm just going in alphabetical order here if you didn't notice, my beloved, are you listening, Dr. John Curran? My beloved Nemesis. So that is your warning, listeners. If you are worried about having any of those titles spoiled, you might want to read them before proceeding, because the spoilers really will be plentiful here. It's the only way to have an in-depth conversation about what Agatha Christie does with the characters in her stories, who I am going to call gay rather than queer. You can't see me right now, but I am using air quotes. A good place to start with this discussion is the notion that there are queer characters all over the place in Christie. She and her co-authors even referred to themselves as the queer women of the voluntary aid detachment who worked as nurses and dispensers in the First World War in that lovely handmade magazine that they constructed, What We Did in the Great War, which I discussed with Karen Robinson in my last episode. They weren't implying that they harbored same-sex attraction for each other by calling themselves queer women, more that they existed outside the norm in some way. This is also how my good friend Jamie Bernthal uses the term queer in his fabulous book, Queering Agatha Christie, which my former partner, the late Catherine Brobeck, and I interviewed him about many years ago, and which I am including as a bonus rerun at the end of this very episode, because I think it is essential listening if we are going to consider this topic in any sort of a serious way. So queerness then isn't about being gay, or I should say it isn't just about being gay. It's more broadly about being outside the mainstream in some way. And crucially, it's about questioning what is and isn't normal and how we make those value judgments that result in normal versus quote unquote abnormal. To be queer is to push back. And applying that sort of a lens to Christie's work is incredibly illuminating, which is what Jamie did in his book and what you will hear all about at the end of this episode, after my original contribution here in the first part. And in this first part of the episode, I am going to be more circumscribed about things, more, dare I say, reductive. Because I can hear some of you out there yelling at your phones or tablets or car speakers or whatever. Yes, Kemper, that fancy literary theory stuff is well and good. But bring on the gays. the gay characters within Christie's texts who are written either explicitly or subtextually as harboring what I will call a same-sex attraction, even while acknowledging that the term same-sex is much more diffuse and complicated and potentially problematic than I have the room or, quite frankly, the expertise to get into here. I do just want to be clear about that because it is Pride Month, after all, and I, for one, am not going to sit here and pretend that my, and I have to imagine to some extent our, understanding of what constitutes gender and gender expression in 2024 isn't vastly different from what Agatha Christie's understanding was. And thank goodness for that, I say. But limiting myself now to those quote-unquote gay characters in Christie, some of these characters are, in my opinion, extremely delightful. Some of them are middling, and some of them are abominable. And I know you're all going to be shocked when I tell you that I have composed a list of 10 of them that I will now go through in rank order from lowest to highest. I also have a list of another 10 honorable mentions that I'll go through after my top 10, since, as you all know, I cannot help myself on this podcast, nor do any of you seem to want me to help myself. So let's get started, shall we? Before I do, however, I just want to make a blanket statement about the way Christie deploys her gay characters. As a rule, none of these characters is ever the murderer, which means we never get a same-sex flavored love or lust or loathing motive in Christie, which we do get in other mystery authors from this period. And that is a good thing because such depictions age even worse, I think, when the puzzle mystery hinges on them. In Christie, these depictions are always incidental to the main intrigue, which isn't to say that some of them haven't aged terribly, in my opinion. Of course, every rule has its exception, which is why I am starting all the way at the bottom in our number 10 slot with Christie's original stage play, The Rats, and specifically the character of Alec Hanbury, who is my pick for the most horrendous depiction of a gay character in the Christie oeuvre. And Alec is the exception to the rule because in The Rats, he is unquestionably gay, and he unquestionably turns out to be the murderer. Alec murders a husband to frame that husband's wife and the man she's been having an affair with for the husband's murder. What's more, Alec's motivation is revenge because he was in love with this wife's first husband, who the wife did actually kill. This is some truly sordid stuff, and The Rats is definitely a nasty little play. I haven't actually covered this play yet, either here or on the podcast's Patreon, which I will do at some point. So I'm going to keep my commentary limited to Alec here. But here is how he is described when he first appears on stage. Alec enters right. He is a young man of 28 or 9, effeminate, very elegant, amusing, inclined to be spiteful. He has a very artificial manner and is dressed in the height of fashion, even wearing gloves. Of course, since Christie is Christie, that final little detail about wearing gloves turns out to be key, since Christie didn't waste a word when she could possibly help it, even in an original play first produced in 1962. Gotta love that, Christie. But don't gotta love this hateful character. He calls the couple who he's framing my dears, and calling people my dear or my dears is going to be a running theme of this episode. It's a telltale sign that we are dealing with a gay character in Christie if the person in question, the man in question, I should say, is addressing people as my dear or my dears. No one likes poor Alec. The wife who he is framing says of him in a very flat way, I don't think he likes any women. And speaking at least for myself as a gay man, which again is all I can speak for since gay men are not a monolith, I definitely like lots and lots and lots of women. Binders full of women, if you will. But moving on, as this awful couple are figuring out what is happening to them, because to be fair to Christie, all of the characters who appear in this play are hateful, not just Alec. There are only 4 characters total, and they're all just a nightmare. This is what the homewrecker of the play, the boyfriend David, says about Alec. You said he was devoted to your first husband, Barry. You've only got to take one look at Alec to see what kind of devotion that was. Oof, homophobic burn there from David. But you know what? Alec is seemingly successful in his frame up job. So this is the rare, rather nihilistic Christie work in which our murderer seemingly does not get his comeuppance. I still don't like anything about this depiction, which is why it is sitting here at the bottom of my rankings. All right, let's move on to number 9. This character exists within the world of The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. His name is Haley Preston. What's that? You have no memory of who Haley Preston is? Well, that's part of the problem. He's a rather underwritten character, and that too, unfortunately, will be a running theme in this episode. Haley is the publicist slash PR man slash personal assistant, it's all a bit vague, of Jason Rudd, the film director who is the husband of the actress Marina Gregg and very much within the film industry himself. Our Inspector d'Histoire, Inspector Craddock, refers to poor Haley Preston as that willow wand of a young man. And we also know that Haley has long, wavy hair. At the end of the novel, Miss Marple tells Haley Preston that he reminds her of a man she knew, because of course he does. This other man's name was Gerald French. And Haley Preston asks, "Indeed? What did Gerald French do?" "Not very much," said Miss Marple, "but he was a very good talker." She sighed. "He had had an unfortunate past." "You don't say," said Haley Preston, slightly ill at ease. "What kind of a past?" "I won't repeat it," said Miss Marple. "He didn't like it talked about." This is totally Miss Marple indicating to Haley Preston that she knows his secret, i.e. he is a male homosexual and he better shape up. If anyone has a different interpretation of this rather throwaway moment, then please contact me, because I would love to be able to not ascribe this rather searing instance of homophobia to my dear Aunt Jane. But I believe that is what's happening here, and I do not like it. And Haley Preston is one of those characters that I do my best to forget whenever I read The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. On that note, we're going to move swiftly along to number 8, another character from The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. This would be Johnny Jethro. When Inspector Craddock goes to Margot Bentz's studio, Margot Bentz is a photographer who worked at that deadly fate, that fateful fate, where poor Heather Badcock met her end via a poisoned cocktail. Anyway, Margot Bentz has an assistant in her studio, Johnny Jethro, who calls Craddock "my dear" multiple times, and he is described by Craddock as almost as willowy as Haley Preston. Damning words. Johnny's hair isn't wavy, but rather exuberant, which may be worse. I'm not really sure what exuberant hair exactly is. I'm thinking maybe Christopher Lloyd in Back to the Future, Einstein in that poster everyone seemed to have in college. I don't know. Johnny Jethro is wearing, quote, a kind of lilac smock, end quote. I think it's pretty clear what Christie is implying here. And just in case it isn't, later, Inspector Craddock refers to Jethro as Margot Bentz's, quote, pansy partner, end quote. Way back when I interviewed the author Kitty Murphy, whose fabulous mystery novel, Death in Heels, takes place within the contemporary drag community in Dublin, we were speaking a little bit about being within this community and being lovers of mystery. And we talked about how rarely the word pansy comes up in Christie. And I, at the time, was at a loss to even think of one instance. Well, here is one. And one of you listeners wrote in about another, which I read out in a previous housekeeping/mailbag segment. And I will get to that other instance later in the episode. Just something to look forward to. That's really all I have on Johnny Jethro, who is an even more incidental character than Haley Preston. The reason that Haley Preston is ranked lower for me is that I find that little moment with Miss Marple where she compares him to Gerald French to just be so upsetting. I will note that both The Rats and The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side were unleashed on the public in 1962. And while accurately pinpointing when Christie actually wrote a work as opposed to publishing it or having it produced is a bit of a fool's errand, it's very complicated because she wrote so much and her notebooks were always in such disarray. It's interesting to me that these two creations couldn't have been too far away from each other in the chronology of her writings. Like, did she meet some gay fellow in her theatrical endeavors in the early 60s who just really rubbed her the wrong way? I don't know. Just a thought. All right, let's move on to number 7. And we are dealing here with another Miss Marple story, although this one is a short story. It's Greenshaw's Folly. And the character in question is Horace Bindler, literary critic and friend to, oh yes, best-selling author Raymond West. Can you take a guess as to what 2 of Horace Bindler's first 3 words are in this story? That's right, my dear. So the author, Raymond West, is entertaining the literary critic, Horace Bindler, down in the country, and he's trying to keep dear Horace amused. So he brings him to the titular Greenshaw's Folly, which is an estate. It's this architectural monstrosity that Horace appreciates with all the stereotypical bitchy irony we could expect from such a gay character. It's this hideous house that has all these different architectural periods blended together, a chimera or Frankenstein's monster of a house, if you will. And we get our first glimpse of Horace when he gets his first glimpse of Greenshaw's Folly. "But my dear," he cried, "how wonderful!" His voice rose in a high screech of aesthetic delight, then deepened in reverent awe. "It's unbelievable, out of this world, a period piece of the best." And you might have thought that I stumbled over the word aesthetic when I was reading out that quote, but no, Christie writes it as apostrophe STHETIC, aesthetic. Which I think I commented on when Catherine and I covered Greenshaw's Folly. I just really love that. Aesthetic delight. Horace Bindler isn't done. He goes on a few lines later. "This will be one of the gems of my collection. I do think, don't you, that it's rather amusing to have a collection of monstrosities? The idea came to me one night 7 years ago in my bath." He's somewhat amusing. I will give him that. This Horace Bindler, which I cannot say for Alec Hanbury, Haley Preston, or Johnny Jethro. And did you catch the fact that he collects things? Ding, ding, ding. This too will be a running theme among many of these characters. Many of the gay men to appear in Christie are collectors of one sort or another. Horace says "my dear" at least 2 more times in this story. He asks somewhat impertinent questions of none other than Miss Jane Marple, and leaves the story bundled off to London just as things get interesting. Sigh. As I said, he does a little bit better than the characters before him, but not very well. This is not a great depiction either. Next up, we are going to move from Miss Marple to Monsieur Poirot. It is time to discuss Lord Edgware Dies. Twice. We have 2 characters here from Lord Edgware Dies, just as we had 2 characters from The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. So first up is Alton, Lord Edgware's butler. He is the source of some red herring intrigue in this novel, but he definitely is not the murderer at the end. Poirot theorizes that Alton stole money from Lord Edgware after discovering his dead body, which is not good. He is definitely not an admirable character in any way whatsoever, but he is not the murderer. Here is how Alton is described when Hastings and Poirot visit Lord Edgware's pad in Regent Gate. And as this is an early-ish Poirot, we still have Hastings narrating the story here. I believe this might be the last Hastings narrated Poirot that we have until, of course, Curtin. But that means we're getting a little view here into Hastings's internal monologue. And is anyone surprised that Hastings turns out to be a little homophobic? Here he is on Alton. "One of the handsomest young men I have ever seen. Tall, fair, he might have posed to a sculptor for Hermes or Apollo. Despite his good looks, there was something vaguely effeminate that I disliked about the softness of his voice. Also, in a curious way, he reminded me of someone." And a few lines later, Hastings references that same soft voice, which I instinctively distrusted. The someone Alton reminds Hastings of is Brian Martin, who is also described by Hastings as being extremely handsome. Brian Martin is an actor within that novel. Again, since Christie tends not to waste a word, this resemblance is a plot point. But I love the fact that apparently to the virile Hastings, all handsome men look alike. Sure. And it doesn't end with Hastings. Here is Inspector Japp's analysis of the handsome Alton. "It isn't natural for a man to have good looks like that." Huh? I feel like this is Christie's way of implying that Alton's effeminacy was in his appearance as well as his voice, without having to come out, pun intended, pun always intended, without having to come out and say it. But that's really all I have on Alton. Let's just move right into my number 5 pick, which is Lord Edgware himself from Lord Edgware Dies, because much later in the novel, we get this tidbit about Lord Edgware. Lord Edgware was a man of peculiar tastes. It was possible that facts about him had come to light which, while not entitling his wife to an English divorce, might yet be used by her as a lever, coupled with the threat of publicity. I think it is heavily implied that Lord Edgware was embroiled in something inappropriate with his butler, Alton. Inappropriate to me as to power dynamics, not as to same-sex attraction. For a titular character and a murder victim, Lord Edgware is a criminally underwritten character. So that's pretty much all I've got to say about him and his potential same-sex attraction. But the reason he edges out Alton is that he is at least the titular character, and I will count that as a win. All right, let's move on to my number 4 pick, who comes from Murder is Easy. That's right, it is time to speak about Mr. Ellsworthy, the antique dealer and occultist. Here is how he is described early-ish on in the book. Mr. Ellsworthy was a very exquisite young man dressed in a color scheme of russet brown. He had a long, pale face with a womanish mouth, long black artistic hair, and a mincing walk. Say it with me, people. Ugh. Ugh as to the stereotypical nature of this depiction, of course. The long hair, the mincing walk, the womanish features. Christie is often not subtle about this sort of thing. Dr. John Curran actually cites Mr. Ellsworthy as one of those characters Christie depicted as a figure of fun, which isn't great. And yet, Mr. Ellsworthy does have one of the best lines in the novel. When our hero of a sort, Luke Fitzwilliam, encounters him on a hillside, he asks Mr. Ellsworthy if he's been admiring nature. And this is how Mr. Ellsworthy responds. "Oh, no, no. Oh, dear me, no. I abhor nature. Such a coarse, unimaginative wench." That's a great line. He's at least able to have a little bit of fun here, a la Horace Bindler. Mr. Ellsworthy is actually referred to as, quote, definitely queer, end quote. Though again, that word doesn't mean exactly what it does today. Not that it even really means just one thing today. But aside from this, we also get one of Christie's clearest references to gayness in the oeuvre, which is surprising given that this novel was published in 1939. I think, as we can already see from this list, she tended to deal with this issue, even if just subtextually, later in her career rather than earlier. But there are some earlier references, and this is one of them. Here we have Major Horton responding thusly when Luke asks the Major whether he ever asks Mr. Ellsworthy to play golf. "He doesn't play golf. Much too much of a Miss Nancy." Wow. And I mean, it is a total cliche that gay men don't like golf, and I'm sure there are plenty of gay men out there who adore an hour or 2 or 3 or 4 on the course or the links, but that is one cliche I am happy to uphold. I am very much not a golf fan. So you go, Mr. Ellsworthy. And I would argue that Mr. Ellsworthy is the first character on this list who is not merely incidental to the story. He is one of the biggest red herrings of the book. His quote unquote perverse occultist ways get a lot of attention, and yet he has nothing to do with the murders that take place in this book, the many murders that take place over the course of Murder is Easy. And yet, even though he is not the murderer, at the end of the novel, Luke tells his lady love and sometime co-investigator Bridget, "I think something unpleasant is going to happen to our Mr. Ellsworthy. Battle is planning a little surprise." That would be Superintendent Battle, of course. And to me, it feels like a nasty little parting shot at Mr. Ellsworthy. I made this point when I covered the new BBC adaptation of Murder is Easy over on the podcast's Patreon account. But in an adaptation that was willing to play fast and loose with so many aspects of identity for purposes of a more inclusive and diverse cast, which I applaud, to be clear, I thought it was such a missed opportunity to excise Mr. Ellsworthy from the proceedings, rather than incorporating this definitely queer character into the community on the screen, given that he was right there in the text, and perhaps doing something different with him from a 21st century perspective. It actually felt a little cowardly to me, given how far the adaptation was willing to go in other respects. So perhaps one day our Mr. Ellsworthy, and I am not being ironic with that our, the way that Luke Fitzwilliam was being, perhaps one day our Mr. Ellsworthy will have his day. All right, let's move on to our top 3, winning the bronze medal here for gay characters in the Christie oeuvre. From The Moving Finger, another Miss Marple novel, is Mr. Pye. And I'm going to quote now from the text. Mr. Pye was an extremely ladylike, plump little man, devoted to his petty-point chairs, his Dresden shepherdesses, and his collection of bric-a-brac. It was hardly a man's house. Oh, Agatha, and look at that, we've got another collector here. What a coincidence. Elsewhere, Mr. Pye is described as not an ordinary man, but a certain kind of man. That is when Jerry and company are theorizing that a woman-like man may have written the nasty poison pen letters at the heart of this mystery. Here is another description. Lonely and unhappy and spiteful. Everyone, you see, rather laughs at him. Can't you see him secretly hating all the normal, happy people and taking a queer, perverse, artistic pleasure in what he was doing? There's that word again, queer. Jerry's sister Joanna even says that Mr. Pye, quote, is a middle-aged spinster, end quote. And at another point, Mr. Pye is said to have an abnormally female streak in his character. And, it strikes me that that word spiteful, which Christie uses to describe Alec Hanbury as well, is not a word that would ever be used for a straight man, either in Christie or I think popularly, certainly at the time that these works were first published. It seems to have been reserved for women and gay men. Just wanted to point that out. It's a rather coded description. And then finally, there's this incredibly catty moment when Mrs. Dane Calthrop is holding up a large red lobster that she got in the local fish shop. And she says, have you ever seen anything so unlike Mr. Pye? Very virile and handsome, isn't it? Oof. I love you, Mrs. Dane Calthrop, mom of Bunch Harmon. And yet that feels like a rather low blow. Do better, Mrs. Dane Calthrop. Do better. I have refrained from quoting my good friend Jamie Bernthal during this segment of the episode, since you'll hear from him a little bit later, but I just have to quote him now on Mr. Pye. As a character, he is sufficiently underwritten to accommodate any thesis about Christie and homosexuality. Pye has been read as proof of his creator's homophobia and as proof of her liberalism. And that is such a good point, because everything that is said about Mr. Pye is in the words of others, all the people who make up this wonderfully, dare I say, spiteful little village of Limstock. We can disagree with these characters and pity Mr. Pye. We can agree with these characters and jeer at Mr. Pye. We can do a little bit of both. It's all up to us. And this is so often the way it is in Christie. There is room for interpretation in this way. And I think that's just a really important point to remember. Catherine and I spoke a lot about that with Jamie, so you will be hearing more about that in the second part of the episode. All right, I'm pretty much done with Mr. Pye, because it's true, he is underwritten, as so many of these characters are, and yet I would definitely put him in the same category as Mr. Ellsworthy, in that he's more than an incidental character. He is a major source of the red herrings swirling throughout that novel. He has nothing to do with the central puzzle or who is pulling off these murders. And even though there is a lot of fun had at his expense, I found overall the depiction of him, and even the distance between him and the more mainstream characters in this novel, just to be a little less pointed and nasty than it was in the case of Mr. Ellsworthy in Murder is Easy. It's still pretty pointed and nasty, to be clear, but slightly less so, which is why Mr. Pye gets our bronze medal here. Let's move on to our silver medal. In the number 2 slot, we have Christopher Wren from The Mousetrap. And I talked about Christopher Wren somewhat recently in my marathon episode, all about the Mousetrap. But he is an architect, even though he is not that Christopher Wren, obviously. He is also one of Christie's more forthrightly gay characters. I'll just do a little rundown here of the many gay ways of Christopher Wren. He is into antiques. Giles calls him a twerp and adds, "I've got no use for that kind." When our policeman, Trotter, comes onto the scene, Christopher calls him terribly hardy and goes on to say to Molly, "He's very attractive, don't you think so? I always think that policemen are very attractive." It's really rare for Christie to depict an actual same-sex attraction in this way in the course of one of her stories, but she absolutely does it here, and I think it's even more striking given that this is happening in front of a live audience. This is a stage play, not just the pages of a novel. So I think that's very significant. And then, according to Dr. John Curran, in the original script of the play, Christopher Wren is described as having a, quote, pansy voice, end quote. That is not the second instance of pansy that I referenced earlier in the episode, by the way. That is still to come. So that is who Christopher Wren is, and in that he has been prancing about Monkswell Manor in front of audiences for over 70 years now. I'd say he is easily one of the most prominent gay characters, if not the most prominent gay character within the Christie canon. That is why he is getting the silver medal here. I don't think his characterization is particularly apt or accurate or sensitive or nuanced or even convincing when it comes to his gayness, but he is decidedly gay and he is decidedly not a villain, and that counts for something. I did not mention this in my episode all about the Mousetrap because I stuck there to my resolution not to spoil whodunit in any way whatsoever. I didn't want to tip my hand at all. But for my purposes here, I can point out that in the 70th anniversary edition of the play script, which seems to be the one that is performed nightly in the West End, the final line of the play belongs to Christopher Wren, and it is a comedic one. So yet again, we have another gay character who does not turn out to be the murderer, and I for one think that is something to celebrate in a play as celebrated as The Mousetrap. All right, let's move on to our number one slot here when it comes to gay characters in Agatha Christie's oeuvre. I'm sure many of you know exactly what book I'm going to bring up now. Oh yes, it is A Murder is Announced, yet another Miss Marple novel, and we have to discuss the Misses Hinchcliffe and Murgatroyd. Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd are simply our gold standard when it comes to Christie's depiction of not just a gay character, but two gay characters who are engaged in a healthy, functional, and sympathetically portrayed relationship. That is why they easily win the gold medal here. I just have to pause to note that I don't think it's a coincidence that our winning depiction is the sole entry on this list that has to do with lady on lady attraction as opposed to dude on dude attraction. Listen, there is a long history of heteronormative panic as to male same-sex attraction that does not exist when it comes to female same-sex attraction, or at least exists in a substantially weakened state, I would argue. This is usually attributed to the fact that such conventions developed by way of the heterosexual male gaze, which tended to feel threatened by male same-sex attraction and titillated by female same-sex attraction, so that by the time we get to someone like Christie writing in the heart of the 20th century, even though she is obviously a woman, she inherited this cultural double standard. It was kind of baked in at that point. I am now officially getting beyond the purview of this episode and once again beyond my expertise, so I will leave it at that, but I did want to point this out. And have no fear, I will be getting to the other instance of female same-sex attraction that many believe exists within the canon when I get to my honorable mentions. But let's glory in Miss Hinchcliffe and Miss Murgatroyd a bit, shall we? It is clear from the get-go that they are lesbians and a couple. We know this the instant that they are introduced into the story. They are referred to as each other's friend, and Miss Hinchcliffe has a short, man-like crop. I see what Christie is doing here. She even has some innocent fun with this depiction. For instance, Miss Hinchcliffe references Miss Murgatroyd playing Hermia in A Midsummer Night's Dream at the Women's Institute. I really love that. You can just imagine Hinch ogling the heck out of Murgatroyd on stage. Christie even alludes to Miss Hinchcliffe perhaps having feelings of attraction for other women in the story, which I found to be pretty significant. Here she is remembering Philippa Hames in the drawing room of Little Paddocks on the fateful night that the announced murder took place. I remember noticing what a nice flat back she has, and I thought to myself, that girl would look well on a horse. I was watching her and thinking just that. Do tell, Hinch. But, of course, matters take a tragic turn for Hinchcliffe and Murgatroyd, and this, too, is in keeping with earlier depictions of same-sex couples who often came to a tragic end, as happy endings tended to be reserved for more mainstream members of society. And yet, I can't really fault Christie for this, because it's in her depiction of Miss Hinchcliffe's grief when Miss Murgatroyd is murdered that Christie makes it clear how seriously the romantic relationship between these two women is to be taken. Here is Miss Jane Marple herself standing with Miss Hinchcliffe in the immediate aftermath of the discovery of Miss Murgatroyd's body. They stood there, side by side, the rain beating down on them, and the older woman's arm went round the younger one's shoulders. Be still, my heart, Miss Marple, she gets it. I mean, I wish she could have gotten it when it came to Haley Preston and or Gerald French, but I digress. And then we also get this lovely narrative passage. Nobody offered Miss Hinchcliffe sympathy or mentioned Miss Murgatroyd's death. The ravaged face of the tall, vigorous woman told its own tale and would have made any expression of sympathy an impertinence. Just beautiful, and proof that Christie is by no means one note when it comes to her depiction of gay characters. Thank goodness for Miss Murgatroyd, and in particular for the grief-stricken Miss Hinchcliffe. Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
All right, so that brings me through my top 10 gay characters in Christie, but I mentioned that I have a bunch of honorable mentions because I couldn't help myself, and I'm just going to run through them now a little more quickly than I did my top 10, and these aren't really in any particular order. So first up, we have Philip Blake from Five Little Pigs. This is really a shout out to the superb adaptation of this novel by David Suchet and the Agatha Christie's Poirot program. Philip Blake was made to have a same-sex attraction to Amyas Crale in that adaptation, but I think you could argue that it is subtextual in Christie's novel, and it just makes so much sense. So I wanted to mention it here. Next up, we have Mr. Shaitana from Cards on the Table. He is our main murder victim in that story, and he is definitely very much othered as to all sorts of stuff, all sorts of aspects of identity. But I think there's a fair argument to be made that he too is a gay character within a Christie novel. For me, I consider him a quote unquote queer character within Christie more than an explicitly gay one. But you may differ on that point, and I think that is entirely defensible. So I just wanted to mention him. Next up, we've got Mrs. McGinty's Dead, and I just wanted to discuss the character of Robin Upward because he is our murderer, and there's maybe an argument to be made that he too is a gay character, so this would be another exception to the rule that gay characters never did it. in Christie stories. Robin is a playwright with mommy issues, after all. I'm stereotyping here, but hey, so was Christie. Perhaps, though, I am being influenced by the fact that it is Robin himself who uses the word pansy, which one of you, dear listeners, pointed out to me when I asked you to bring me instances of the word in the canon. So this is the second instance of the word that I referenced earlier in the episode. It happens when Robin is speaking with none other than Ariadne Oliver, because he is adapting her Sven Hirsen character for the stage, and Robin suggests that they make the Finnish detective younger and in love with a girl. He says that the feeling of sex antagonism will pep the whole thing up enormously. And what does Mrs. Oliver coldly reply? Sven Hirsen never cared for women. You tell him, Mrs. Oliver. And this is Robin's reply to that. But you can't have him a pansy, darling. Not for this sort of play. I mean, it's not Green Bay Trees or anything like that. It's thrills and murders and clean open-air fun. So that's a little bit of a question mark on Robin Upward himself. But the notion that Sven Hirsen could be gay brings up an excellent point, which I would like to cover in my next two honorable mentions. So first up, we have Mr. Satterthwaite, who, of course, appears in the mysterious Mr. Quinn short stories, and also in 3-Act Tragedy. And he is perennially single. And I think there are many avid Christie fans who have read The Mysterious Mr. Quinn and 3-Act Tragedy and who have wondered to themselves, could Mr. Satterthwaite be a gay character? I personally think the key to Mr. Satterthwaite is that he is an observer. This is something that is mentioned many, many times, especially in the Mysterious Mr. Quinn stories, which means that even though he is very much a part of the society in which he lives, he has entree to everyone and everything. He is still on the margins. He still exists as an outsider. He also alludes to past loves of his he did not capitalize on, and they are clearly female love interests. So I think the speculation about Mr. Satterthwaite being gay is more of a modern gloss on the character. And I would say much the same thing about my fifth honorable mention, who is Monsieur Hercule Poirot himself. And this comes up constantly, listeners. I think there are a lot of people who wonder if perhaps Poirot could be gay because he too is single. And let's just pause a moment and acknowledge that we really should not be making any assumptions as to sexual orientation when it comes to perennially single people. The choice to cohabitate or even just coexist in any way with a partner is a complicated one with many variables. So I don't even think that's an assumption that I would celebrate or support in any way, but I get it. I get why people make that assumption and how they make that assumption. We also have Poirot's seemingly platonic love affair with dear Captain Hastings. They do live together, after all, at some point early on in their adventures together. But he also has a long-standing relationship with Mrs. Ariadne Oliver. And a great regard for the Countess Vera Rosikoff. That is canon. So I don't think there's really much there. But I'm not in any way bothered by the speculation when it comes to people wondering if Poirot is gay. And we do have lots of moments in which he appreciates male beauty peppered throughout the canon. I personally will never forget his appreciation of the garage mechanic Ted Williamson in The Arcadian Deer. He is just blown away by Ted's beauty. So I just had to mention our dear Monsieur Poirot. Moving on now to my sixth honorable mention, which has to do with After the Funeral. Catherine and I touched on this when we covered that novel. This is all totally subtextual, but is there perhaps something going on between Cora Lansquenet and Miss Gilchrist? Some quasi-romantic relationship that Miss Gilchrist might have been uncomfortable with. There would have been a power imbalance in that relationship as well. Could that have added fuel to the fire, resulting in Miss Gilchrist murdering Cora Lansquenet? I don't think there's actually much evidence for this. This is really just an interpretation of mine as a reader, and I don't really have any hard textual evidence, which is why I am including this as an honorable mention only. But I think it's interesting. All right, next up, my seventh honorable mention has to do with Halloween Party. We do not have a specific character here who is quote unquote gay, but we do have the male teenagers, Nicholas and Desmond, trying to impress Poirot with their know-how. And they do so by theorizing that there could be latent same-sex urges among the female teachers in the community, spurring those teachers on to murder. Desmond calls one of the teachers queer, and Nicholas clarifies lesbian, using a, quote, man of the world voice, end quote. And Desmond responds, I shouldn't wonder. It's one of those thoroughly modern moments in Christie, and I just had to note it, even though the boys' theory isn't meant to be taken seriously, and thank goodness for that. But it is a rare moment in which the notion of same-sex attraction is squarely mentioned. There is no subtext here. We are in the 60s. Next up, we've got Endless Night, and the architect, Rudolph Santonix. This is not the first gay or potentially gay architect that we have come across in a Christie story. I really don't have much textual evidence for this one either, which is why I have put Santonix in the honorable mention category. But his relationship with Mike Rogers feels fraught in a potentially gay way. To be clear, I don't think there's a relationship between the two of them. I think it's more about the regard Santonix holds for Mike Rogers. And to a certain extent, that regard goes both ways. But Santonix seems to understand, to see Mike Rogers in a way that no one else does. This is a possibility that others have brought up to me, so I wanted to mention it here. All right, I have just two more honorable mentions, and my next one, my ninth one, is a biggie. So this has to do with Clotilde Bradbury Scott. And I talked about this at great length with, oh yes, Jamie Bernthal, who so kindly co-hosted the episode I did all about Nemesis when it was covered for the podcast's ranking project. I do not actually think Clotilde Bradbury Scott is a gay character. But there are many who would cite this novel as another exception to the rule that the gay character is never the murderer in Christie. And I will acknowledge that that reading of the novel is by no means uncommon. My reading of the novel is probably a little more uncommon, actually. There are many who believe that Clotilde harbored a same-sex attraction for the young Verity Hunt and then killed her out of this intense and burning lesbian passion. I felt quite convinced when I read Nemesis for the podcast, and that was within the context of all of Christie's work coming before it, which I had read as closely as I did. I felt quite convinced that Christie was depicting yet another instance of a possessive mother love on the part of a non-biological mother, which is something she did time and time again. So that is why Clotilde does not appear on my proper list of gay characters, but I had to give her an honorable mention here in acknowledgement of this alternate reading, because I'm sure there are a lot of you who, when I was going through my top 10, were like, where's Clotilde? I hear you on that, even though I don't agree with you. And then my 10th honorable mention has to do with the Miss Marple short story, Death by Drowning, and the minor character, Rex Sandford. And I am mentioning this last because this is a bit of a defense of Christie here. And you all know I will defend Christie whenever I possibly can. So in this story, we have a young woman who seemingly died by suicide after the man who impregnated her refuses to marry her. The truth is more complicated than that, as it always is in Christie. But the man who did, in fact, get the murder victim into trouble is, wait for it, an architect, and here is how Christie describes him. He was a tall young man, very fair and very thin. His eyes were blue and dreamy. His hair was untidy and rather too long. His speech was a little too ladylike. That would seem to be a classic Christie description of a gay character down to his profession. And yet, Rex Sandford is the man who carried on an affair with this young woman and did indeed get her pregnant. So That is clearly not what Christie is doing here. I don't think she's making a nuanced point about a character who potentially could alternately identify as gay, but also carried on an affair with this young woman. No, this is not a gay character here. This is a character who she is othering, who she is queering. And that is precisely why it is so helpful and interesting to think about the queering of characters in Christie, as opposed to my simplistic, but I hope fun and diverting, investigation into who may or may not be, quote unquote, gay. We could also say the same thing about the pretty long-haired boys who populate a few of Christie's later novels, most particularly Third Girl. I don't think any of those characters is meant to be gay, and yet Christie uses some of these same tropes to describe them. As usual, where Christie is concerned, it is complicated. All right, I have a few parting thoughts for you before I send you on over to that earlier episode with Catherine and with Jamie Bernthal. I am sure that I am missing some characters who you might think of as, quote unquote, gay characters in Christie. Please write to me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. I would love to include your thoughts on this topic in a future housekeeping/mailbag segment. In particular, I didn't go through all of the short stories with a fine-toothed comb, so I may have missed some minor or perhaps some major characters there. There must be some gay characters in some non-Miss Marple short stories, right? Maybe even some of the Tommy and Tuppence short stories. I mean, Partners in Crime does open up with a short story titled A Fairy in the Flat. Sorry, I was contractually obligated to make that joke on this episode. A little borscht belt humor for you. But that does bring up another point I wanted to make, which is that same-sex attraction does seem to crop up a bit more in the Marples than the Poirots, given that we have so many fewer Miss Marple novels and short stories than we do Poirot novels and short stories in the canon. Miss Marple is disproportionately represented here on this list. All sorts of gays in Miss Marple content. And I think that's because Agatha Christie used the notion of same-sex attraction existing in the world as a way to prove that Miss Marple knew what was up. I believe it's in A Caribbean Mystery where Raymond West even muses, does his dear Aunt Jane even know about queers? And in that instance, queer is definitely equivalent to gay. The answer is, of course, Miss Jane Marple knows about gay people, just as Agatha Christie knew about gay people. And that is probably my most important parting thought of all. And it's a point that my co-host Tina Hodgkinson made on the episode that we did, along with two other co-hosts, all about ableism. And what Tina said is that even though it's important that we critique and respond to Christie's depictions that may strike us as stuck in their time, we also need to give Christie credit for creating these depictions at all. Because there were plenty of writers out there who simply sidestepped such tricky issues. But for Christie, that wasn't an option. There are gay characters in Christie's texts because there are gay people in the world. And you all know I will get on my soapbox and preach about this for as long as anyone will listen to me. But Christie's stories were all set in specific and grounded worlds that reflected her own world and experience. And that is one of my favorite things about her writing. So thank goodness for that. And I think it's so important to keep that in mind when we are critiquing these depictions, which I have done lovingly over the course of the first part of this episode. And in that vein, my final note here is just to give Agatha Christie one extra little bit of credit for something that she never did, as far as I know. Because even though the homosexual did it in The Rats, and maybe even in Nemesis, if that's your reading of that novel, she never went to the well of the homosexual did it for purposes of hiding his or her homosexuality. Because as any avid reader of classic detective fiction will tell you, there were others who sure did. And lots of screen adaptations that sure did as well. Last of Sheila, anyone? So good on Christie for that, and good on Christie in general for writing enough characters and providing enough material for me to go through as many people and as many texts as I was just able to. I had a blast doing it. And again, I want to wish everyone out there a happy Pride Month, especially here in the United States, but to all of you out there, whenever and wherever and however you may be able to celebrate. And with that, we are going to take a little trip into the past, into a much earlier episode of this podcast. So please enjoy my and my dear partner, Catherine Brobeck's conversation with Jamie Bernthal all about queering Agatha Christie. Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Kemper Donovan.
I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And this week we have a special episode. We are interviewing our friend of the podcast, Jamie Bernthal, Agatha Christie scholar and author. And let's just jump right in and get him on the line.
Great.
We are so excited to welcome Jamie Bernthal to the program. Jamie is a Christie scholar who runs the International Agatha Christie Conference, which is a meeting of Christie scholars and aficionados and fans and just generally anyone who wants to attend who come from around the world to discuss all things Christie, which is where we first met him at the 4th conference in Cambridge, which was 2 years ago. And you are actually having your 5th conference this September in Southampton. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And we're very excited now to have a whole new committee. So there are 4 of us organising this one.
Oh, that's fantastic. If there are any listeners who are interested in attending that conference, where should they go, or what's the best way to find more information about that?
If you go on Twitter and you can look at my timeline, which is at JC Bernthal, or you can go on the hashtag Agatha 2019, which is where we talk about the conference.
Well, we had an amazing time at the 4th one, so I'm sure the 5th one will be even more fun. And as everyone who listens to this podcast know, we can never get enough of discussing Christie. So the other reason why anyone who listens to this podcast probably recognizes your name is that we reference your book quite a bit, Queering Agatha Christie. But, and this is a bit of a confession here, we've only thus far referenced your book fairly glancingly, I would say, steeped as it is in literary theory, because your book is both a rigorous analysis of existing theory and then a series of original and I would say pretty brilliant arguments that contribute significantly to the ever-growing body of literary theory out there in the world as it applies to Agatha Christie. So this episode is our big opportunity to get down and dirty with some lit theory, get our lit grit on, so to speak. I suspect, Jamie, it's going to be a much less lit theory-oriented discussion than you're used to having, while for us, it will certainly be a much more lit theory-oriented discussion than what we're used to having on the podcast. So my hope is that we will bridge the gap and meet somewhere in the middle. First off, the part of your book that made me laugh aloud, or LOL as the kids say, because why wouldn't I want to start there, was when you wrote about how when you tell your friends you're in the middle of writing a book applying queer theory to Agatha Christie, you invariably get 2 responses. One, is Poirot gay? And 2, did you know there's a lesbian couple and a murder is announced? And the real reason I wanted to start there by mentioning that anecdote is that I think a lot of people uninitiated in the world of literary theory, and more specifically queer theory, might assume that applying queer theory to Agatha Christie means something along those lines, i.e., reading the text and looking for clues or codes as to which characters are actually, and I'm using air quotes here, actually gay, or at least not straight, such as Lord Edgware and Miss Butler and Lord Edgware Dies, Mr. Ellsworthy and Murder is Easy, Mr. Pye and The Moving Finger. We've discussed all of those characters on this podcast already. We have not discussed the Mrs. Hinchcliffe and Murgatroyd yet, since we haven't gotten to A Murder is Announced, but that is not at all what you're doing in your book. So I would love it if we could clarify what queer theory means, what it actually is as you're using the term in your book, and I will start us off by quoting you. Queer theory stands for adopting and embracing a position outside and excluded from the dominant norm, which therefore holds that norm up for interrogation. And I think it's that last clause that's the key one, which therefore holds that norm up for interrogation. So queerness isn't so much about being not straight or more broadly, not normal. It's about questioning what is normal and not normal, and questioning those very categorizations and the methods we use to make those categorizations. Is that a fair definition, or am I completely butchering it?
Yeah, that's bang on, I'd say. The other thing that I'd add is that with queer theory, we're able to laugh at the categorizations and the identity labels we have thrust upon us, and we're able to see it all as a little bit silly. That's probably the bit about queer theory that really appeals to me. But yeah, so I still get people now saying, so is Folly gay? And did you know about the lesbian couple in Murders Announced? And now more often it's, what did you think about all those lesbians in the Miss Marple TV series and things like that? And to be honest, that doesn't interest me so much as using the book as a queer person to see what these tell us about identity itself, rather than just looking for gay characters.
Right. It's such an important point that the questioning is about identity itself, and that's what Christie is so often doing, and where we do get that sense of irreverence and playfulness in the text, which honestly is often the first thing to get thrown out when the text is being adapted. And I think is so important to what appeals to her as a writer. And there's so many reasons, I think, why she is as popular as she is and has remained as popular as she is. It's never going to be one thing. But I think that element is so key, and it's one that is often misunderstood.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that if we try to say Christie is popular because she offers escapism or a puzzle or simple English or whatever people say about Christie as the reason she's so popular, well, you can think of 100 different writers who also do that. I don't think we can ever stop digging and trying to find out what it is that makes Christie so great. And I completely agree with you. Kemper, one of the things that the adaptations often miss out on is that real playfulness, that not taking the world she's writing about seriously at all. And that's what really appeals to me as a queer person who is not perhaps normal in that sense. Seeing the world of respectability made completely ridiculous in Christie's books is absolutely brilliant.
I've mentioned this author a couple of times on the podcast, and I only just made the connection as you were saying this, but I've made a few parallels between Christie and Austen before, and I know, and there's so many people that will just immediately say, what are you talking about? There's nothing similar about what those two authors do. But one of the things I cherish about Austen is that she often does the same thing.
I think that the reality, and you could say this, you could probably make this argument about a number of crime writers, but what crime fiction essentially does, right, is break apart the normal universe, or the universe as it appears to be, right? The world as it appears to be is a category that we use every week, at least in every novel episode that we cover. And the world as it appears to be also certainly has applications when you're talking about queer theory, because what you're essentially doing is breaking apart the normative universe, in this case through a crime, and it's allowing you to examine social structures in a way that I don't think that you necessarily otherwise can, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, it's interesting to me that essentially you're using it as a framework to do what we already do. And so, it's surprising that more people don't think about it in those terms as an interrogation of the normative, because that is what crime fiction all does. That is how it operates and functions in general.
Absolutely. I think one of the reasons, the main reason I chose to write this about Christie is because she is the best writer ever, and there's no one else that should be written about. But also,
we agree.
But also because she's kind of become known as a very establishment figure, and people talk about going to London and you see the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace and you see the Mousetrap. And she was a DBE and best-selling author of all time and all that. So in a way, there isn't really a writer who's more established than Agatha Christie. But I think that one of the greatest strengths in her work is one of the things she's most criticised for. And that's the use of stereotypes and stock characters and all these recognisable tropes. And I think that's actually insanely brilliant writing. By the end of the book, we found out that this character we'd known everything about all along has a big secret. So everything we think we know about these recognizable characters goes out the window.
Right. No, I think that that's a very astute point. And I mean, even some of the tropes and standard things that we make fun of, I mean, we always have the running joke on the podcast that if Christie mentions an actor, you should be very wary. But I mean, all that an actor is doing or serving as here is a little bit of an easy code for what she's doing elsewhere. Everybody is an actor, right?
Oh, yeah. Can I go a bit confessional and talk about my childhood?
Of course.
Please.
Go for it.
So Christie was the first grown-up author I ever read, and I used to pose with her books on the bus when I was 8, that kind of thing. And what I loved about her was that I loved the puzzles, but I also loved the characters because they were so recognizable, so apparently respectable, and all so stupid. And it just helped me come to terms with all these grown-ups around me who kept telling me they knew better, and some did and some didn't. And it just helped me realize how ridiculous the world around me was. And as a kind of a queer person, and a person who asked questions, in school and things, and used to get told to stop spoiling the lessons.
I remember that, Jamie.
Once our teacher read a story about a trip to the moon, and I put my hand up and said, "How are they breathing? There's not much oxygen on the moon," and the teacher got really cross and he told me to stop asking questions. Then I went home and read an Agatha Christie story, and Poirot does similar things. And everyone said, "Oh, shut up, you're a foreigner, you don't understand what's going on." And then at the end, he wheels out this apparently irrelevant question and proves that it was not only relevant, but the answer to everything. And so this undermined person has his voice at the end of the book and systematically excoriates and dismantles this really respectable social world he's entered into, and then he just minces out at the end. I loved that as a child, and maybe I just haven't grown out of it, but I think it's a really basic, really simple, but drastically effective way of undermining middle-class arrogance.
I completely agree, and I mean, I think that Kemper and I also both read Christie very young, and I mean, I think I graduated from Nancy Drew to Agatha Christie, in probably the 4th grade, and I certainly had a similar experience. I always like to tell people that for a bit of a goody two-shoes as a kid, I was sent to the principal's office rather frequently, and it was getting in trouble for questioning lessons, and so to have that sort of ability to go to Christie and interrogate the world and not just have it not be something to be sent to the principal's office for, but to be encouraged, because that's how Poirot in fact corrects the world order, is by questioning it. I think that's an incredibly valuable thing, especially for a young reader.
So many people have contacted us too and let us know that Christie was in some ways their entree into adult reading, and a lot of that has to do with the simplicity of the language. And simple language allows you to access a lot of different things, and I think grapple with some of the issues, whether they be questioning and feeling thwarted, that a lot of younger people are often dealing with. When you talk about one way of reading Christie, there's no reason, no one is saying, well, you should be reading it this way and not this other way, because people do read Christie in so many different ways, and they're obviously all valid. And she wrote so much and has so many readers that it's pretty much limitless, right? How you can read her, what you can get out of her, and that's part of the fun. That's part of the reason we can talk about her ad nauseum. So I would love to actually talk about Vera Rosikoff because and we just talked about her recently, and you talk about her at some length in your book. I would say that I personally agree with a lot of what you say in your book about the way that Vera Rosikoff is portrayed in the text, especially in those 2 short stories that we covered in The Double Clue and The Capture of Cerberus. She is very performative. We likened her to Auntie Mame or Hello Dolly. You talk about the almost drag-like performance that she's putting on in the text. and how different that is, crucially, to the portrayal of Vera Rosikoff and the Poirot-Rosikoff relationship in the Suchet series. The Suchet series is not your cup of tea. It is my cup of tea. I think it's Catherine's cup of tea as well. I don't want to speak for Catherine. Okay.
No, I have. It's hard to have watched something since the time you were a small child and not have overwhelming affection for it, in my case.
But I absolutely agree with you when we talked about it on the episode that the Suchet series is doing something, to use modern parlance, a lot more basic, and for me, less interesting than what Christie is doing on the page. And I think what she is doing does allow for some really interesting interpretations about gender and the performativity of gender and femininity, etc. But I think that in general, for me, and this is going to be my attempt to defend the Suchet series, because I was thinking about this as I was preparing for this conversation. I was like, well, why is it that I actually do like the Suchet series as much as I do? Because I have a lot of issues with other adaptations of Christie. And I do think, we were just talking about the irreverence and the playfulness and the sense of ridiculousness of Christie in the text and the horizons that opens up for a reader. And I do think that the Suchet series does capture a lot of that irreverence in a general way. I agree with you that their portrayal of Poirot as a fairly straightforward hero is, not what we have in the text and is a departure. And everyone says Suchet is exactly Poirot on the page, and he's not. It's definitely an interpretation, but in that every character has their foibles and is both revered and laughed at in different moments in that show, especially in the early seasons, which are by far my favorite. We're always able to both love and laugh at Miss Lemon and Japp and Hastings and Poirot. And it's this idea that, I think somewhere you talk about, rather than making fun of a specific stereotype, rather than making fun of a character by way of a stereotype, often what Christie is doing is making fun of stereotyping itself, right? Because she's playing with all these stereotypes. And I feel like the Suchet series does capture some of that, and I wonder if you agree or disagree, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I definitely agree that it was a much stronger series earlier than later, although some of the later episodes, I have seen them all, are brilliant, like After the Funeral is a fantastic show. David Suchet, his interpretation of Poirot is really, really great, and something he says that Agatha Christie's daughter, Rosalind Hicks, told to him was the audience should be laughing with Poirot, not at him, and he really took that on board and created a really believable character. And it is a character that a lot of people love. Personally, the series is a little too earnest for me. It's a little too invested in keeping things the way they were and seeing Britain between the wars as a chocolate box England, which it definitely wasn't. So it's not personally to my taste, but I think it's a really good series, yeah. Although I will never forgive them for the Lord Edgware Died adaptation, because it's such a bad adaptation of such a good book.
Fair enough. One of the other series that you do bring up in your book, in which we discuss at great length, especially as we're getting into more Marple novels, we're now officially in the second half of Christie's oeuvre, so we will be covering more and more Marple as we go along. We'll be marpling, as we call it. We've turned her into a verb. Is the ITV Marple series. I actually really appreciated how you clarified what that series is doing wrong. And again, this is all an opinion, but I agreed with you 100% because we have this notion, and it's something that even Matthew Pritchard, who, Christie's grandson, and head of the Christie estate for many years, said when the series first came out. He said that what it was doing was essentially just making homosexual characters more overt. I believe this is what he said. If you read the books carefully, it's all there. So I feel like what he's doing, what the series doing, is what a lot of people would assume queer theory, quote unquote, is doing, i.e. going through text and labeling anyone who's othered in a particular way. They have long hair, they have a soft voice, they're interested in art collecting, etc., saying those people are gay. or they're at least not straight. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of the point that you make in your book is that by taking certain textual allusions and turning them into various homosexual stereotypes on the screen, obviously gay men who lisp and mince and have strange comings out moments, and women who appear mannish, etc. The series is saying this is what it means to deviate from the norm. They're making a sort of black and white case for queerness. Being queer means X. Whereas, as you put it, queer approaches to identity should be harder to pin down. They should be slippery and elastic, because that is, in fact, what makes them queer, their ability to escape a coherent characterization, and that Christie's texts leave room for that slipperiness and elasticity, whereas the ITV series leaves no room at all. Is that a fair assessment of your critique, or one of your critiques of what that series is doing?
Yeah, totally fair. I totally understand why some people think it's a great thing to look for gay characters in the books and then bring them onto the screen as openly gay characters. In fact, there is someone at Agatha Christie Limited whose part of their job is to read the books and look for characters who might be gay.
Oh, wow.
That seems like a little bit like hunting for something. I don't know how I feel about that.
Well, it's certainly a worthy idea behind it, but personally, I find it quite problematic. I think, A, we're building on stereotypes and character types and personality types and labels that we have now, which obviously didn't mean the same thing in the 1920s, 50s, or whatever. So that's a bit dodgy. But as you said, Ken, but this idea that anyone who deviates in any way from whatever this idea of the norm is has to be labelled gay. That suggests to me that gay is A, the only alternative to being normal, and B, weird, wrong, not quite right. So it seems dodgy to me to say that someone like Mr. Pie is definitely gay, and I'm sure you've discussed before some of the outrageously camp things they did to that character in the TV thing.
Oh my gosh, it's over the top.
Yeah, and it's a negative stereotype, so it seems much more closed and dangerous to me than having the space to interpret these characters in our own way. And actually, in the Moving Finger adaptation, a lot of the characteristics that are given in the book to Jerry, the hero, are given in the ITV adaptation to Mr. Pie. In the book, it's Jerry who has an interest in crockery with flowers painted on it. And things like that, who takes an interest in Megan's clothes and makeup. And in the TV adaptation, that all goes to Mr. Pye.
Jerry has quite a disturbing interest in Megan's clothes and makeup in the book.
Well, yes. Jerry is an interesting character because he's trying to be a romantic hero and seems to be going about it in quite a dodgy way. As always, in my life, I find the straight people the most dodgy.
I mean, quite often the case in general. Yeah, the level of sort of mansplaining and control that Jerry wants to have is disconcerting, to say the least.
You didn't find it romantic when he ripped her bodily onto a train?
Oh, yes, I know. It's what every girl wants.
I would say that in the book, that is not necessarily seen as a good thing. But in the TV adaptation, he acts basically the same and is rewarded with a happy ending, and he gets the girl. Whereas in the book, I think, or certainly the way I read the book, is it's just another performance. This idea of turning a girl into a woman is quite distasteful, but it's what he thinks he has to do because he's the hero of the story. So I find that a much less problematic thing to experience than that absolute travesty of TV adaptation.
We haven't touched on this yet, but since we're talking about Megan's makeovers, etc., and, Kemper mentioned Vera Rosikoff, you can certainly use the same tools of queer theory to look at the role of women and how women's femininity is portrayed or performed, perhaps. So in The Capture of Cerberus, you have this overly performative older Vera Rosikoff, and then you have her daughter-in-law to be, who the entire clues are basically set up in how she performs her feminine dress, right? That's like one of the crucial clues in the story. And thinking about that also in terms of Megan, who's also described as wearing like shapeless, frumpy clothes. It's interesting always where Christie actually comes down on that and what is actually being said in the story versus what is just simply a clue.
This is going to sound awful, but I'm so glad that Agatha Christie is dead, because if I met her and found out her views one way or the other, I'm not sure I'd be able to read her books with the same freedom I have now. So,
well, we do say, right, that you should never meet your heroes.
Oh, absolutely. So someone like Vera Rosikov in Cerberus is a woman should look like this. She should wear the makeup, she should wear the 5 feet tall hair or whatever, and, her job should be to attract men or whatever. Whether Christie is actually agreeing or not, this brutal assessment of a young woman who wants to, I think, be a scientist or something. Whether Christie agrees or not.
Sociologist, right?
Sociologist, yeah. I'm getting it mixed up with Judith Hastings in Curtain, who has a very similar thing said to her. And it does make me wonder if Christie is using her own sentiments or not. But either way, she's putting them in the mouth of a palpably unreal character. A character who's so over the top and so silly and dressy and showy and exaggerates her artifice in such a way that can only have the effect of drawing attention to the fact that she's not real, she's too much. And that's why it's so funny that a diminutive, pretty little man like Poirot has to have a woman interest. He chooses someone who's so elaborate and over the top that the language being used of Rosikov is the same as language that was used of drag queens at the time.
Right.
It's there as a kind of pillory, and we can see how ridiculous a lot of our social mores are.
Yeah. No matter where Christie herself lands on it, the important thing is that we have the room within the story, and then looking at that in the context of all the other stories that she wrote to kind of come down wherever we want. There's just the ability to get out of that something real in terms of the performativity and whatnot. Sorry, Catherine, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, though, that the artifice of Vera Rosikov, right, actually has a parallel in the artifice of Poirot, which is sort of made fun of by Hastings early on in like a teasing way, right? But they're tools. It's a tool for Vera Rosikov too. These sort of camp elements serve as a distraction from what she's actually doing, much as how Poirot's deliberate performative foreignness also serves as a distraction from his ability to actually investigate a case. It serves him to his advantage to be thought of often as the outsider or the foreigner, and to have essentially costuming conceal his true intentions. So, I guess in some ways, the frumpy costuming in Cerberus versus Vera Rosikov's over-the-top costuming are essentially performing the same task, i.e. they are performance.
I often quote Suchet's book, Poirot and Me, his sort of memoir of taking on the character, which is, mainly a delightful read because it shows, I think, the care with which he approached the project, and he read all of the texts, and he certainly did his homework, and it shows in the series. But when I was looking up for Vera Rosikov episode, his comments on it, for me, and again, this is my opinion, I think he fell into the trap that so many do when they say, oh, well, Vera Rosikov is his Irene Adler. She's the woman who got away, and this is a very romantic thing. We're going to make a lot about that in this straightforward romantic way, and I just don't think that's borne out by the text. And I think that even though I believe that, I think there's a lot that Suchet did that is married to the text. He got a lot of those quirks, right? He lifted them from the page. He, I think, got a holistic sense of Poirot that is in many ways accurate, but that was one instance where I felt like he got it wrong, quite frankly, and I think you can see that in the Double Clue episode and in the way that it departs, in which I just didn't find as satisfying or, quite honestly, convincing.
I'd agree with that. In Queer Christie, my book, I devote quite a big chunk to taking apart that adaptation with the Vera Roscoff character, who is this sort of saintly older woman who is just right for Poirot because she needs Poirot to save her. And it just seems so annoying and dodgy to me. Because this character is so fun in the books and not a nice woman. She is a criminal, and she's an unrepentant criminal who will happily let Poirot get someone else arrested for her crime. She's absolutely brilliant, a brilliant counterpart to Poirot's attempts to become a conventional detective. Throwing Roscoff into the mix, I'd say she's there to respond to the generic demand for a romantic interest, and also for a character like Irene Adler, but she doesn't fulfill those functions conventionally, and that's part of Christie's brilliance again. And then, of course, when the TV series changed its tone and wanted to bring back Roscoff for the Labours of Hercules, they ended up having to create almost a different character for their screen adaptation. And so in the end, on the TV screen, we have two Roscoffs, a saintly one and a bitter one, neither of whom are this fun, vibrant character in the text. And that does make me wonder, as a person observing from a position outside of normality and respectability and straightness, it makes me wonder why don't they want a woman who enjoys herself? Why can there only be a jaded, bitter older woman or a lovely, saintly older woman who needs to be saved? So that's one of many reasons I find, as a queer person, the book so much more interesting and useful and exciting than the TV adaptation.
I so agree with that, and I think when we reread the story, especially the double clue for that episode, I was struck by how Poirot, one of the things he appreciates about her is almost her sense of humor. I mean, he appreciates her fabulousness. He gets how fabulous and over the top she is.
Although, weirdly enough, even Captain Hastings does, which is the funniest part of that story.
Right. It's like they're both just bowled over by her and how larger than life she is. It's why I thought of Auntie Mame immediately, just because that's so much of what that character is and is doing to staid straight men in that story, be they boys or men. It's so interesting and it's so fun, and you're so right. It's like that character is so much fun, and that is what Poirot appreciates about her. The way that she laughs it off when he finally says, well, can you give me back the jewels now? And we just get zero of that in the adaptations. I agree 100% on the criticism. They did not get Vera Roscoff right by any means.
Well, it might also be something about the permissivity structure for what women can do, right? In a weird way, I think, even when they were making those adaptations, you probably still have some greater constraints about how you can portray femininity, especially if it's going to be a romantic interest in some way on screen or on the page.
Yeah. When I was reading the passages of your book that actually do have to do with feminine performance and, this idea of constructing femininity in Christie, I had half an idea that I wanted to run by you and see if you think there's anything in it, which is that you discuss at some length The Man in the Brown Suit, which we very appreciate. It is a favorite of mine and Catherine's. We never miss an opportunity to reference The Man in the Brown Suit whenever we can. So we're very, very excited to be able to do so on this episode. Because the funny thing about Christie when it comes to female narrators is that we only have two novels, right, that are narrated from a first-person female perspective, and Man in the Brown Suit is one. It's not even fully narrated from a female perspective, but mainly. And then Murder in Mesopotamia, which I treat as a little bit of an outlier in several different ways, but a lot of that narrative is also riddled with this kind of self-doubt of Nurse Leatherin as to whether or not she even has the wherewithal to tell the story. But, The Man in the Brown Suit is obviously a very early novel. It's her fourth. And then Murder in Mesopotamia, I believe, is 1936, so that's fairly early as well. And it's just interesting that even though she did subsequently write a number of novels, some of them standalone after she got out of the Hastings narration mode, those first-person narratives are from a male perspective. And I was just thinking, as you were discussing kind of what she did in The Man in the Brown Suit in terms of feminine performance, and then how that was graduating into what she does with Jane Wilkinson. Control yourself, Catherine. Lord Edgware dies.
My arch nemesis.
Your arch nemesis. And even Orlena Stewart in Evil Under the Sun, and how these characters, these female characters whose femininity is kind of central to what's happening within the story, they almost seem to get more distant from Christie, which of course allows her, I think, to kind of make more elaborate and sophisticated constructions of femininity in these feminine performances. And I'm wondering if that maybe explains why she didn't really choose to narrate from a female point of view, which many people find curious. Maybe the question itself should be questioned, but many people find it curious that she really just chose so rarely to write from a female point of view. So, yeah, I don't know. I was wondering if you thought there was anything in that idea, or just if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I think that's a really interesting idea, and one that has a lot of mileage. Of course, Christie originally wanted to write as a man, but she took quite a lot of persuading to publish under her own name. And I think she had this idea that a male voice carries more authority. In that sense, she was perhaps a product of her time. But I completely agree that it has something to do with the lack of agency that women seem to have in her books, which is something that sometimes she's focusing on, sometimes she's not. So in the case of, for example, Dr. King in Appointment with Death, that's a character who seems to have a lot of agency and has a prominent role in the novel, but still is constantly referred to as Miss King and has to marry a male doctor at the end of the story. And so she doesn't really have that much agency at all. Whereas a character like Arlena in Evil Under the Sun, it's very clear to us all along, or by the end of the book anyway, it's very clear that this apparently powerful and dangerous woman is nothing of the sort. She is a victim. Poirot calls her a victim eternal and predestined. And what we find out is that she's never really had her own personality all her life. Arlena's personality, like Beryl Roscott's actually, and also like Jane Wilkinson's, is constructed by the men around her. So when people call her a Jezebel or a harlot or a dangerous woman or the personification of evil, they're actually personifying their own lust or envy or confusion in the body of this woman. And that's something completely typified by the fact that her corpse ends up interchangeable with another woman's corpse. So in many ways, Christie was writing in a world where women didn't have as much agency as they seem to have, and that's still a problem in a lot of areas. And she was reflecting that through her plot. Such a clever and effective way to make that message, I think.
And it would be so difficult, I think, to make that message as effectively as she does if she was writing from a forthright female point of view. And I think maybe that in some ways explains why that narrator in Murder in Mesopotamia is the most apologetic narrator. I mean, she starts off by saying, a man asked me to write this. It's the only reason I'm writing this. And I'm probably going to do a terrible job of it because I'm not a writer. I'm just a nurse, but here goes. To me, it feels like in The Man in the Brown Suit, that is a novel where she's trying, I mean, and this is a little bit my gloss on a more of an autobiographical read, but perhaps things weren't going super swimmingly in her own life, in her own relationship, and this is a bit of a fantasy, and it's just romance from beginning to end, and infusing a story that is written by its quote-unquote female lead with this fantastical romance is something that works for that story. I just don't think it's something she was ever interested in doing again.
No, I agree with that. The Man in the Brown Suit is an extremely experimental novel. She'd just written The Murder on the Links, which is a very Sherlock Holmes-esque story, which actually nicked half its plot from Sherlock Holmes. And so it makes sense that she gave the narrative, largely gave it to a young woman who earns a living by her pen, if you like, who's just setting out in the world and trying to carve her own place in that world, and is appealing constantly. And Anne Bedingfield is constantly appealing to stories about women written by men. Mm-hmm. She watches The Perils of Pamela, I think, on the screen, which is obviously a mockery of The Perils of Pauline, a story about a young, plucky heroine, entirely written by men. There's something very clever going there in how Christie does the writing, but I think you're right. I think it was in the 30s or 40s, she wrote a story from the point of view of Miss Marple. That was actually a radio script, which she then read out herself on the radio. It's called Miss Marple Tells a Story. But other than that, and Mesopotamia, and The Man in the Brown Suit, and her memoir, that's all she wrote, yeah. So it is a really interesting thing that maybe someone can look at one day.
So I actually wanted to ask you about something I personally really dislike in Christie, which I suspect you really like. and I wanted to discuss it so that maybe you can make me feel better about it. So one of the things I really personally dislike are the meta moments in Christie, when characters say, this is just like a detective novel, or they reference how such and such plot point they've just experienced would work in a detective novel. For me, those moments take me out of the novel to such an extent that the story becomes in real danger of breaking down, i.e. they're kind of more trouble than they're worth for me. I imagine, and I don't think you deal with these meta moments too much in your book. I think you make a couple of references to them, but I would imagine that for you, the idea of being taken out of the story is kind of the point, and that she has many ways that she does this, but this is a way of pointing to the fragility of the world that she's creating, these various stereotypes. It's a way for a reader to question exactly what's happening. It's actually very modern, right? It's a meta moment. This is not something that, again, Christie gets a lot of credit for doing, but the only other reason why I have issues with them is that I think
you don't like that Poirot exists within the Christie universe?
Or like when the boy in The Body in the Library asks for, mentions all the signatures of authors he has, including Agatha Christie. I don't. And I actually, this is a super unscientific study, so it might be totally wrong, but I think that she does it a lot in her thrillers, even more so than in the puzzle mysteries. And for me, what they feel like, and I know this is just my opinion, is a lack of confidence in the robustness of the world that she's creating, i.e., I know this sounds sort of fake, so I'm just going to hang a lantern on it, so to speak. I'm just going to point that out there, and then let's just move on, shall we? But I don't know. I would imagine that you perhaps have a different perspective on this, or maybe not. What do you think?
I'm just recovering from the pain you've caused my soul. You compared Christie earlier to Austen, who absolutely did those missing moments. The whole of
Northanger Abbey
is entirely, I think, probably the one book that precurses Golden Age detective fiction more than any other. You can guess exactly what I'm going to say. I absolutely don't read the books to escape. I read them to see what they're saying about the world around me and about identity and about people and psychologically. And so acknowledging their own artifice is a huge part of that. I wouldn't call it lazy. I'd call it absolutely brilliant. It's not like just saying the title of the book at some point in that horrible cheap way that gets a laugh when someone says it in a film. Like
my all-time favorite is,
I'd like to take his face off.
Yeah. Christie doesn't do anything quite that tacky. She acknowledges the fact that it's artificial, and actually it's not just the boy who has Agatha Christie's autograph in The Body in the Library. The Body in the Library itself is a cliche in crime fiction, and so that whole book is a parody of the cliches of crime fiction. So I don't think it's fair to draw out that one incident and point out that as a meta moment. I think the whole book is a meta moment, and you're never really supposed to think these things are actually happening. But there are other things like in Tommy and Tuppence. Each one of those stories in Partners in Crime, of course, is a parody of an existing detective, and one of those characters they parody is Hercule Poirot. They're reading a Poirot book and decide to act like Poirot. At the same time, in Tommy and Tuppence's world, Inspector Jack is a real person. Mr. Robinson, who's another one of Poirot's contacts, is a real person. And so there's a sense in which these books are always definitely acknowledging the fact that they're not real, I think.
Well, and I mean, I think that Kemper, like, against your point also, you would a little bit have to just completely discount the character of Ariadne Oliver if you're going to make that argument, because all Ariadne Oliver is hanging a lantern.
This is true. I'm not joking that I asked the question, because I knew that you would have, both of you, have good points to defend why I'm wrong, and I want to be wrong, because it's one of the few things that Christie does consistently that I don't love. The only thing I would say to counter what you just said, Jamie, is that for how I read Northanger Abbey, for example, the text itself is a send-up, is a spoof, and you're right, The Body in the Library is probably the worst novel to reference to bolster my argument, because I think you would probably say you could read all of her novels this way, but that one certainly, we have lots of both textual and kind of super textual support. I mean, Christie herself in her preface said that this is a spoof for why why that novel is very Northanger Abbey-ish in that way. Some of those moments to me, though, just stick out in some of the other novels, and I do not have any specific examples.
The thing about Northanger Abbey is, yes, it's a spoof on the Gothic romance, but also what it is, it's a commentary about readers, right? That's essentially what Northanger Abbey is doing. And so I think that if you look at that, especially in terms of like the Tommy and Tuppence partners in crime stories, part of why they're charming and part of why the meta references are charming is Tommy and Tuppence don't know what they're doing. They have no clue what they're doing. They're literally just, aggressive readers who kind of got thrown into this. So part of how they're going about their detective agency or their fake detective agency is by mimicking how you would act if you were an avid reader. And I think that that's far from being something that you should ignore. I think that it's charming, and I think that it's an interesting commentary.
Yeah, I agree.
Fair enough. So I had one other question on adaptations for you, Jamie, and we haven't aired this episode yet, but we did a special episode on the ABC Murders adaptation that came out recently, and it kind of opened up a broader discussion of the quote-unquote new BBC adaptations that have been happening in the last couple of years, starting with And Then There Were None and The Witness for the Prosecution. We did not watch Ordeal by Innocence since we haven't covered. Actually, Catherine did. I did not because we haven't covered it yet, and I just want the story to be as fresh as possible when we do cover it. But I know that these Sarah Phelps adaptations have caused a stir among fans of Christie, which is great. It's led to a lot of discussions. There's a lot that we actually really like about what she's doing in these adaptations. There's one thing in particular that I'm curious to see where you come down on it, in which I find a little bit questionable, that came out of something that Phelps said in an interview when she was doing press for the ABC Murders. And here's what it is specifically. I'm quoting Phelps here. She might not have written any sex or swearing and drug taking and whatever, but I'm sure she would have if she could. And she was making the larger point that a lot of the elements that some fans of Christie are seeing in her adaptations, the darker kind of things that go on in the world, are 100% there in the text if you're going to look for them. And I think that there is an argument to be made that this is very similar logic to what Matthew Pritchard was using when he said that the ITV series was simply making homosexuality more overt, i.e., we know these elements are hidden in there, and now that we have the wherewithal in our enlightened times to bring them out, we're going to shout them from the rooftops. So if I had to encapsulate what my issue was, specifically with the ABC Murders, let's not talk about any of the other adaptations. I have no issue with even any of the changes that she made in there or some of the darker elements that she decided to dwell on. For me, it feels a little bit like perhaps what the ITV series was doing with gayness, or I guess you could say queerness, even though they were eliding it in such a black and white way, in that there's a shouty element to, for example, xenophobia, whereas in the text, it is very much dealt with. I mean, we have Franz Asher, who's this deeply flawed character. He's abusive, he's alcoholic, but he's totally unfairly scapegoated. It's a Poirot novel. We always know that Poirot is a foreigner himself. It is 100% there in the text, and I remember after reading the text for the podcast, I came away with it feeling like, wow, Christie's saying a lot of really interesting things about xenophobia in here, much more so than she does in a lot of other books. That's really interesting. I don't know if I came away from the Phelps adaptation feeling like that because such a big deal was made of it, for example. And I'm just wondering where you come down on that, because my sense from, honestly, your tweets and whatnot is that you're a huge fan of the Phelps adaptation. So I'm wondering if you agree with that or disagree, or just what you think about that point.
Yeah, I agree and disagree with Sarah Phelps when she says that Agatha Christie would have written about this stuff if she could. I mean, don't forget that Agatha Christie was writing in the 60s and 70s when people were writing a lot about sex and drugs and all that kind of stuff. And when asked why she didn't put sadism and drugs and violence and all that sort of thing in her books, she said, well, it just sounds rather boring to go through it all like a catalogue. It's a brilliant response. But at the same time, it can lead to the ABC Murders and see that she's got her finger on the pulse of what's going on in the world or in the country at that crucial moment. What I think is good is that Sarah Phelps has drawn out these elements in the books that haven't been drawn out in other adaptations. The ITV version of the ABC Murders really did make it look like England in 1936 was this glorious place where everything was black and white, and, the only racism we got was people calling Poirot a funny little Frenchman, and there was nothing worse or less benevolent than that. Whereas Phelps points out that there is other stuff going on in this text, and so she draws that out in a way that is nothing like in the book. Of course it's not, but if I want the book, I will read the book. I just find a sort of socially tuned-in adaptation a little more refreshing than a conservative adaptation, but both are completely valid. I also obviously like the ABC Murders because I'm in it.
Yes, that's right. Jamie is. Where are you? Where do you appear again, so that people can freeze frame on their Amazon video, and at least if they're in the U.S., that's where it's distributed to see you.
I have the extreme starring role of Bulky Man in the background on the train at the end of episode 2. I got to stand next to John Malkovich for about 3 hours. It's great fun.
I have a little bit of a lightning round of fairly simple questions that we wanted to ask you. What is the first Christie that you read?
My mum helped me read Curtain first.
Wait, what was the book that you read with your mom?
Curtain.
Oh, Curtain.
And then I read Lord Edgware Dies by myself. That was the first book I read completely by myself.
Got it. Catherine still hasn't read Curtain.
Oh, no.
Obviously, I know what happens. I never wanted it to end when I was a kid. And so, I know, I had plowed through all of them in, maybe a year or two. I just, voraciously read them, and I didn't want it to end. And if I read Curtain, it felt like it was going to end.
I have a lot of friends who are in the same position, who will not read Curtain. They will reread any of the other books, but they will not read Curtain because they don't want Poirot to go.
Right. So no, completely how I feel. It's really stupidly sentimental, but
they're part of our lives.
It's true.
That's absolutely true. Do you have a favorite, Christie?
It changes like the weather, or it just changes a lot these days. But always up there will be And Then There Were None, obviously. And I'm afraid, too, that you don't like Lord Edgware Dies and Cards on the Table. Probably two of my absolute favourites.
Well, I like Cards on the Table. I just happen to think Jane Wilkinson is my personal nemesis, so...
I think Catherine was so seduced by Jane Wilkinson's performance. She was so taken in. She was so duped by everything that she just can't forgive her. She's basically embarrassed. She's embarrassed for herself. And it speaks to the power of the text. I love Lord Edgware Dies, actually. Lord Edgware Dies would be ranked higher if I could have my way. And I actually think we both really like Cards on the Table, actually. It's such a divisive Christie, though. It's almost like a litmus test. There are certain Christie readers that loathe it and certain Christie readers that love it. In the novel, Ariadne Oliver is talking about how difficult it is to construct a mystery novel. And I think you actually reference this in your book, Jamie, and it's just a difference of opinion, but you say it's almost ironic because that novel is so well structured. But I actually find that the last quarter of that novel sags, or to me it feels like it's coming apart at the seams and she is sputtering to the finish line and she gets there, but it's getting a little dicey or dodgy, as you would say, toward the end. That's an opinion you obviously disagree with, but yeah.
I would describe it as a parody of books that get dicey and dodgy as they rush towards the finish line and have to have a near-death escape and everything. I would suggest that Christie knows exactly what she's doing there in a way that writers like Edgar Wallace, who did bash out their books, maybe weren't quite so self-conscious about. I think the whole climax of Cards on the Table is just this brilliantly stage-managed work of artifice. It's as expertly choreographed as any game of bridge. And it's so beautifully done. Okay, gun to the head. That would be the gunman, of course, who has his gun to your head. Poirot or Marple? I think I've just been shot. Fair enough. I was like, he's not going to answer that question. And I'm curious, because we haven't really talked, well, we did actually talk about them a little bit. We mentioned Tommy and Tuppence, but among I'll call them the lesser detectives, let's just say they're lesser only in that she didn't write as much material featuring them. But do you have a favorite among Tommy and Tuppence and Parker Pine and the Mr. Quinn, Mr. Satterthwaite pairing? I love them all. As a queer person, I love Quinn and Satterthwaite. Yeah. Mr. Quinn and Mr. Satterthwaite.
I thought you might, and I was pretty sure you wouldn't say Parker Pine, which is, and that actually, Catherine, I think Parker Pine is your true nemesis.
The Jane Wilkinson thing is a joke, right? But, I mean, Parker Pine, like, I legitimately don't like a lot of those stories.
I like Parker Pine stories. I think they're very good.
I like talking about them. I find Parker Pine to be deeply problematic and unethical as an actor.
Oh, why?
Because if you actually look, I mean, we're just now covering the ones that are closer to actual detective stories, but the first chunk of those Parker Pine investigate stories are mostly Parker Pine setting up essentially scams. And, I mean, using levels of unethical emotional manipulation in ways that I think are problematic. And because they're short stories, the most problematic elements of them are really never touched upon. You're supposed to just read through them. I don't actually even know what you're supposed to think at the end, other than, gosh, that's horrifying.
But isn't Miss Marple even more of an arch manipulator?
Well, you know, this is the running joke that I got pilloried for by certain readers or listeners out there for a while about my dark Marple theory, which again, we were saying as a joke. I love Miss Marple, but yeah, Miss Marple is an incredible manipulator. The dark Marple thing is a joke, but at the same time, it's kind of not a joke. She essentially doesn't have a lot of faith in humanity. It's why she's so good at being a detective. She can assess a situation with an astonishingly clear view of what humanity does to itself.
Yeah, she doesn't get invested in any of the people around her. She has a complete ruthless drive to her, Miss Marple. I have a reputation for not liking Miss Marple, and that's not true. It's just I think she's a horrible person, but that doesn't mean I don't love her. I really think she's brilliant, but she is a horrible person. She's not a nice, sweet old lady.
No, she's dark Marple. I mean, this is what I've been saying all along, and that was never to say that I didn't like her or wasn't fascinated by what she does. Yeah. It's to say that how she operates as a detective and her outlook on humanity is incredibly dark.
You have at least one acolyte for the dark Marple.
I think that what drives a lot of the Marple stories, and very much the Parker Pine stories, sometimes in more of a bald-faced way, is cynicism. It's just cynicism. There's nothing taking the edge off of how deeply, darkly cynical she is as to what makes people tick and why they do what they do, and how, not even awful, but just how ridiculous and silly that people are. And I think you get that in the Parker Pine stories, too. And some of it is the short story form, which, Catherine, you just mentioned. I think it's like we almost don't get enough space to process the horror as we do in the Marple novels. And the Marple short stories, they have so much more humor. I think she's able to cut the cynicism just with the character, or just like the superficial aspects of the character, in a way that she just doesn't do in Parker Pine. I mean, in a way, Parker Pine is the purer form of Marple when it comes to that, that cynicism.
Because to be completely honest, the sweet old lady superficial read of Miss Marple is a kind of drag, right?
Yes, I'd agree with that.
Listen to Catherine Brobeck converting new disciples of dark Marple left and right. I don't think Jamie really needed to be converted, actually. Thank you so much again, years later, to Jamie Bernthal, who is such a friend of the podcast and who has proven himself to be one of the podcast's very best friends many times since he did this interview with me and Catherine Brobeck. We loved having him on, and I love being able to interact with him as much as I do and rely on his scholarship and critical analysis and humor. Jamie also writes pastiche. He does satirical mysteries, sending up Agatha Christie and the golden age of detective fiction, and they are a delight. So check those out if you are interested. That would be the Jessica Brick series. So just search for Jessica Brick and Jamie Bernthal. For my next podcast episode, would you believe that I'm going to do another top 10 ranking exercise? I've officially run amok, listeners, but we will be heading into the July 4th weekend, and I thought it would be the perfect time to rank my top 10 Americans in Agatha Christie. Cannot wait for that. In the meantime, you could always head on over to Patreon for bonus content. For June, I have done a comparison between The Stranger by Agatha Christie and Love from a Stranger by Frank Vosper / Agatha Christie. Those are two theatrical adaptations of Christie's short story Philomel Cottage. I had so much fun comparing those two adaptations. I provided a link to the Patreon site in the notes. You can email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. You can find me at Kemper Donovan Books on Facebook. I've provided links to my debut mystery novel, The Busybody. Please check it out if you have not yet done so. And we have officially done it, listeners. There are over 1,000 reviews of All About Agatha in Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for making that happen. It makes me happy, but that doesn't mean that more ratings and reviews won't also make me happy. So keep them coming. Talk soon. Bye.